Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the south in direction of Robotina, where the Russian Ministry of Defense have announced the capture or recapture of Robotina following the third battle of it. However, according to the latest information, the Russians do not have full capture of it, but instead are lacking the final fortifications to the north of it. So the Ukrainians still have a small foothold in the outskirts of the village. However, the Russians captured the majority of it and the whole area to the southeast of it. This leaves only a few fortifications left under Ukrainian control, and the majority of these fortifications, besides the ones at the tip of the village, are located in areas that have poor visibility in a southern direction. This means that the Russians will likely launch offensive operations north of Robotina to capture the fortifications there, to gain full control over the village, and then push towards these fortifications and close the final parts of this wedge here to the south of this long forest line. This would mean and signal the final battles over the Ukrainian summer offensive that would be negated by the Russians. The Russians with this are closer to the recapture of Robotina and have reached the outskirts of the western parts, northern parts and eastern parts where fighting is taking place in the final lines of defense, but the village is not yet fully under Russian control. This will be in the next few days as the Russians continue pressing on the Ukrainian defenses in the area. So this is one of the areas the Russians are currently fighting in, allowing for the Russians to capture approximately 6 square kilometers of territory with the capture of the area southeast of Robotina, following the Russian push through the central parts of the village. We then move on to the northwest of Avdiivka, where the Russians have managed to push the Ukrainians completely out of Vovchansk, following the capture of the central and southern parts of the village. The western parts is still under Ukrainian control. The Ukrainians were forced out of it yesterday, which leaves that the Russians will likely capture this tomorrow or very close, as the Russians will push through to the western parts and recapture it after pushing out the Ukrainians from the final parts of it. This will allow the Russians to start offensive operations in multiple directions. To the south to connect with Nitylove, where the Russians have captured the central road between the two villages, and to the southwest towards Avdiivka to capture that village and start fighting over it. To the west in direction of the lakes here to the west of Vovchansk towards Kushne to start fighting in that direction as well, and in a northern direction towards Novosibirsk Persha. This is connected with the Russians starting offensive operations west of Semenivka, both to connect to Umansk, but also in northern direction towards Novopokrovsk, as the Russians will start pushing in a western direction in a assault towards Novosibirsk Persha from the south and from the east at the same time. This is to expand the front line and to start attacking the next Ukrainian line of defense. North of Novopokrovsk, east of Sokil, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to recapture one of the fortifications and push on to the second one here to the east of the village. This is a very confusing move, as the Russians are currently focused on the northern flank. If the Russians capture the fortifications north of Sokil, they would by that capture the village itself and cut off the supplies to these expeditionary forces counterattacking in the direction of Solovyove. It could be that this is simply some positional fighting to strengthen their fortifications to the east of the village and then relocate their troops to the north to fight back there as well. However, this is a risky maneuver to do, as the Russians currently have the upper hand in the area with the control over Ocheretina. The Russians are in this section of the front line not very active following the Russian Kharkiv offensive. Instead, we're seeing that there is mostly just positional fighting taking place, where the Russians are trying to gain control over Nitylove to the south, counterattack here to the south of Pervomaisk to regain control over Nevelsk, to the north in the direction of Vovchansk to expand the front line and start new offensive operations with the control of the village, and then some positional fighting around Ocheretina, where the Ukrainians are trying to regain the initiative and counterattack the Russian positions. We'll have to see how much the Russians will continue in this section of the front line. It is reported by the Russian soldiers that further offensive operations are planned in this section of the front line. However, we're not seeing any of that yet. Further north, fighting continues in the direction of Chasiv Yar, where the Russians are fighting in the southern and northern flanks and directly towards the micro-district, but there's been no changes over the past 24 hours. We then move on to the Kharkiv offensive in the north. Here we see that the Russians have advanced in the direction of Vovchansk and Lyptsi. The Russians have captured the initial villages here along the foothold that they have gained across the border area It is reported that the Russians are using approximately 4,000 soldiers in these offensive operations, both to the east and west of it. To the south of Lyptsi, they are continuing through the Dacia area, where the fight is reaching in the direction of Lyptsi. And in this regard, we see that the Ukrainians have approximately 3 lines of defense. The first one is near the border, where the Russians were supposed to be halted by an initial line of defense. This consists of minefields and fortified trenches and positions across the front. Then the second line of defense along Lyptsi, Vesele, and so on. This would be one consisted of anti-tank ditches, dragon teeth, and fortified trenches and positions, similar to the Surovikin line. Similar case here in the northern border by Vovchansk. Initial line of defense of fortifications and trenches across with minefields, and then a second line of defense behind with anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth, etc. In the western parts, the Russians have managed to capture the first line of defense and is now fighting at the second line of defense, while in the eastern parts, Russians have captured the first line of defense, but are still moving towards the second line of defense, because in this section it is different, as the Russians have to fight through a wider area due to the Severodonetsk River and the village chain aligned with it. This makes it difficult for the Russians to actually cross over, and the Ukrainians are turning Vovchansk into a massive meat grinder, where heavy forces are concentrated on the Ukrainian side to reinforce the area, and the Russians are slowing down due to the density of the village area, as there is both fortifications in Vovchansk and multiple high-rise apartment complexes, industrial areas, schools, shopping centers, etc. All of these are buildings that are able to hold on to much destruction. It is reported that the majority of the town is destroyed. However, there is no indication as to exactly how much and where, what, and everything else. It's just a broad statement. We do see that heavy bombardment continues over Vovchansk, with both FAB bombs dropping regularly throughout the day and the Ukrainian positions being hit by artillery and MLRS strikes constantly. The Ukrainians are also responding with their own artillery and MLRS strikes. However, the Russians are also conducting counter battery strikes, where we see a lot of those getting hit. So we're seeing a lot of positional fighting around Vovchansk as the Russians try to push through. We've seen that the Russians have pushed through to the eastern parts and central parts. This is in an attempt to cut off this central parts here to the east of Vovchansk. Cutting that off would allow them to quickly capture this part and move on to the southern parts, where the Russians will then be able to have a wide area in which they can attempt river crossings. This is all across the Vovchansk direction, to the east towards the village of Sibne, and to the west all the way to Staritsia. This whole area, the Russians can conduct river crossings. We'll have to see how they plan on crossing the river and exactly how much of force they'll use, whether they will send additional forces to conduct further operations. But the significance of Vovchansk is that the Russians, after the capture of that town, would be allowed to cross over the river and start an assault on the second line of defense. This second line of defense was supposed to be a major defensive line that is well prepared, similar to the Surovikin line. However, we already see these pictures here, which show that these defensive positions were simply not well built. Due to widespread corruption on the Ukrainian side, we see that this second line of defense near Lyptsi, where all of these pictures are taken, not only the trenches where we see that only parts of them are filled with these concrete fortifications and the rest are not at all. We also see that some concrete fortifications are left unbuilt some places and just left on the road in other places. The fortifications were not finished at all, despite having billions of hryvnia to pay for it and a lot of workforce to work for on it, as well as plenty of time to do it. Instead, it ended up in the pockets of some corrupt officials. Similarly, we see this picture here where we see several layers of piles of dragon teeth that were just abandoned by the side of the road. Instead of setting up actual lines, they were simply abandoned. And at the same time, the size of these is about half the size of the Russian ones, which means even if they were well placed, they would likely be ineffective in comparison. So we're seeing that the defensive lines were, instead of being built, just ended up in complete corruption. And this has allowed the Russians to make this significant advances in such a short time with such a small force, and has put heavy pressure on the Ukrainian positions north of Kharkiv. This has forced the Ukrainians to redirect forces from the eastern and southern parts of the front line to reinforce this area. This has put heavy pressure on the Ukrainian defenses and has made the difficult situation much worse. And that'll be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.